when we look back historically in many of the traditional, more contemplative or meditative spiritual paths, we're learning to practice a specific relationship to our mind, really. We're learning how to liberate ourselves from the mind. And we sit down every day for a period of time to try to do that. And the belief is that will then kind of change everything else, which it will. But, and in a sense, the meditation we do here is basically trying to do that same thing. The intention of it is to really liberate us from identification with thought, compulsive identification with feelings, and enable this freedom to emerge that frees us to respond in an unconditioned way, in a liberated way. And yet, what I'm so excited about here and in this evolutionary work, this evolutionary spiritual path, is that this isn't just something we do for half an hour or an hour or a couple of hours a day, or something we just do when we go on a retreat from the world, but this is really a 24/7 spiritual practice, or even maybe not when you're asleep, but it's a spiritual practice you can engage at least all day, woven into your life. And that's, for me, really good news, since we spend most of our lives engaged, not just sitting quietly. And so now this means that we have a lot more time to practice. So we have the potential to dramatically accelerate the spiritual path, because we're not just doing it an hour here and there, but we're really practicing all day long. So it's an engaged way of being, an active spiritual relationship to life that in a sense we can boil down into a set of practices and put them into practice. And that's what we're going to be going into here. Because this evolutionary relationship to life is a very specific thing. And it plays out in very specific ways, each of which, in a sense, we can turn into a practice and put into practice as we go through the day. Before we get into the more specific practices and approaches, I want to just take a moment to go over what we might call the essential orienting framework for this way of living, or some kind of just broad kind of orienting markers for what it really means. So the first one of these is that, in a sense, this evolutionary relationship to life rests on the recognition that life is not fundamentally about me. It's kind of the opposite of the egoic position. And in a way, you'll see that in most of these. They're kind of like the opposite of the egoic relationship to life. So, where the ego says, life's only about me, I'm the center of the universe, this says, no, life's not fundamentally about me. I'm part of a cosmic, universal, unfolding, evolutionary process. And therefore, what follows is that I'm more concerned with the good, the evolution, the welfare, the health of that whole process, of the whole, than I am with my own personal welfare or just getting my own needs met. And of course, I recognize that giving my energies to the evolution of the whole will include taking care of my own genuine needs. So I'm not left out of that picture, but I'm no longer the be-all and end-all. I'm no longer the center of the universe. So that's like a primary stance or orienting realization of this work. My life isn't my own. I'm beholden to something bigger. Which, in a sense, flows right into the second orienting point that I want to point to, which is the recognition, therefore, that not only is life not about me, but therefore my life isn't my own, to do with as I please, that I have a responsibility, even an obligation to other people, to life, to the evolving process, to God, however, whichever of those, touch your heart. I'm beholden to this larger context to evolve beyond ego and become the most awake, enlightened human being that I can possibly be. Because that is what's going to be of greatest service to this process. Only then can I really truly function as a contributor. So therefore I strive to take a full responsibility for all the ways in which I'm not yet that evolved, on my unevolved nature, so I can show up in every situation as an expression of my most enlightened self. The third of these 4 orienting points I'm laying out is that I relate to my life as an evolutionary experiment. In other words, I recognize that there is no roadmap to the future that we're creating. Nobody knows where this is going. There is no, it was not all mapped out beforehand. So therefore if I'm going to participate in this great work, as it's been called, the great work of our time, this great process of evolving consciousness and culture and life and humanity, I need to have an experimental, inquisitive, open, ever-learning approach to life. So I'm always open to new information, new data, always ready to change course or shift my behavior in response to new opportunities. So that there's this great openness and inquisitiveness that comes from that. And then the last kind of orienting principle I would point to is this stance that because I'm now oriented to the reality that life is an unfolding evolutionary process, that means I'm more interested in the future that's being born in this moment, the future that's being born in this moment, than I am in the past or even in the present. Meaning I'm more interested in what's next, where this is going. That's part of what animates us, is the call of the possible, the call of this higher potential to emerge. So I'm not just complacent, content to sit here in the moment and just be, and I'm definitely not oriented to just dwelling on what has been. So instead, I'm always leaning forward into the emerging future that's coming into being. I'm living on the edge of evolution and maintaining a continual posture of stretching forward into that unknown edge. So those are, in a sense, sort of fundamental, or a kind of lattice work into which a lot of these practices we're going to go into sort of weave or rest on. And to distill this down even one point further, these 4 orienting points can be broken, really boiled down into what we could call the North Star of our life. Meaning, like the simple question that guides, in a sense, every moment, which is, what is the most evolutionary, helpful, if you want to make it really simple, what's the most evolutionary or helpful response I could have in this moment? What's the most evolutionary response I could have to this situation I'm in? And that means, what's the response that would break us free from the patterns of the past and be a stand for a new, higher possibility? So in a sense, what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to get this down to something very simple before I then make it really complex. Because it's always good to remember that even though you can make the spiritual path kind of infinitely complex, because every moment's different and there's a different way to respond to every moment, and therefore, we could create hundreds of practices to guide us through our life. But in the end, also, we can boil it down to some very simple fundamentals that can kind of guide us through everything else. So now I'm going to begin going into some of the complexity. But it's not, you'll notice, none of these are complex. They're just different. They're just different dimensions of this kind of, in a sense, how to live an enlightened life, how to live an evolutionary life. Very practically. So the first practice, and I think you'll get the hang of why I'm calling these practices as we go. So the first practice that I want to talk about is the practice of caring for the greatest good. So that can sound very abstract, right? The greatest good. Well, who's to say what's the greatest good? What is the greatest good anyway? What does that even mean? Who's good? So what that means when we boil it down to a practice is it means that in every situation you find yourself in your life, your practice is to stand in a place where you're genuinely interested in and wanting to serve the best outcome for the situation, rather than advocating for your personal agenda. Because, in life situations with other people, or always other people involved pretty much, but even ones where there aren't even directly, in a sense, other people, you could come from it from an egoic stance, which would be, what's in this for me? What do I have to what do I stand to gain? What do I stand to lose? And how am I going to best get my needs met? That would be the basic egoic orientation to every situation we could ever encounter. And most of us consider that normal, right? Humans are self-interested creatures, trying to get our needs met, trying to fulfill our agendas, get what we want. So this is a radical practice, because we start practicing coming from a different place. Meaning, instead of just going with that momentum, we say, what is truly in the interest of the greatest good here? And the greatest good isn't some abstract higher principle, although it is that too. But it's also, just very practically speaking, in every situation, well, what's the greatest good of the whole, meaning of all parties concerned? Some situations concern just a couple of people. Other situations concern a large group of people. Other situations, arguably extend beyond to impact, the planet, right? Certain choices we make are polluting the environment or not. So now they're impacting our whole biosphere. So other choices we make, spiritual choices, potentially impact all of consciousness if we take in that first sphere that we explored last time, right? Because we realize, well, wow, if I give myself wholeheartedly to meditation, that's adding momentum to the deepening, the awakening of humanity. I'm adding momentum. So even those deep interior choices we make in our deepest spiritual practice, again, do we relate to those as, do I feel like making more effort in my meditation today or not? That would be the ego's relation to it. Do I want to or not? What's in it for me? But instead we relate to, no. Why is this important for what do I need to do now to serve the highest possible good? So I hope in that you can just get the sense of how this is something you can apply to any situation at any level. It's a shift in orientation, and it's a practice Meaning you might not feel like serving the greatest good, but you can try to do it. And you can say, I'm going to plant my stake there. I'm going to do that whether it feels good or not. And in a sense that we could just take that practice a little further, or even simplify a little more and say, we're just, what you could call it is the practice of doing the right thing. Right? I mean, that would be the really colloquial, boiled down, simple version. The right thing for the highest reasons, for the greatest possible good. And then the devil's in the details, and God's in the details, right? Meaning it's all going to be about, in each situation, how clearly can we discern what that is, and what do we have available to us to try to serve that. And so yeah, to take that into what is in a sense a slightly different part of that, or a slightly different practice but very related, is that I've spoken a lot in this course, probably more in the Q&A sessions and things, but that there's a moral compass. And moral just means, related to the good, to what's for the good, what's the best thing to do. So we begin to develop a deep spiritual moral compass as we go deeper in our spiritual practice of this relationship to life. And as we awaken this inner compass, meaning it's really a kind of inner navigation system that's telling us clearly, it's like our conscience, which way to go, what to do. And so there's a practice of remaining responsive to the call of that inner compass. There's a deep alignment in it, and there's a deep sense of what we need to do, and we practice by following it, by following our deepest, clearest sense in every moment of the best thing to do. And actually, I like saying the best thing to do instead of the right thing to do, even though I really mean the right thing to do. But everybody, when you bring up the right thing to do, people go, well, who's to say what the right thing to do? What do you mean? There's a right thing? And I say, no, I don't really. But what I mean is the right thing is just the best possible thing that you can sense into. And you don't ever get to know for sure, of course, if it is. So it's to the best. All of this is to the best of your ability in that moment. So that leads us into another practice. Because you see, to be able to discern the greatest possible good, or the right thing to do, well, what are we up against? Our ability to see clearly what that is, for one thing, right? So how are we going to do that? Because we know that human beings are deeply prone to distorting reality. We know that all the ego defense mechanisms that have been cataloged by the psychologists are all ways of distorting reality, ways of distorting our perception in order to defend our self-image. And then have been cataloged by the social sciences, behavioral sciences, I guess it would be more accurate, or cognitive science. Anyway, what are known as cognitive biases, which are, again, all of these ways we human beings are prone to, these tendencies we have to distort reality, to not see things as they are, to want to see things maybe as better than they are, but also at times to want to see things as worse than they are, to want to justify decisions we've made, because otherwise we're going to feel bad that we made the wrong one, so we try to over-justify. There's it's all been cataloged, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I think we all know that we're prone to a lot of distortion. We don't naturally see things as they are. So how we address that is we make a practice of being interested in the truth, which sounds really simple. Okay, right? What do you mean? Of course I'm interested in the truth. No, this has got to be a very rigorous practice, which is I in every situation, I want to be more interested in seeing what's true than in how I feel, than in defending any self-image or any belief I have. Arguably, if you only had one thing you could do to get through this life, facing the truth in every moment would probably be it. You know, and so that then plays out as a willingness to consistently question our assumptions, to assume cognitive biases and defense mechanisms are playing out, and to be interested in seeing all the tendencies to distort the picture, and it's a kind of rigorous, almost at times almost stoic or kind of ruthless in its willingness to simply see what's going on, and like it's this almost yearning, because it's like, I want to be in right relationship to the universe. I want to be in right relationship to other people. I want to be in right relation to reality. And so I have to see what's true. I have to really see clearly. So I have to get out of my filters. It propels us into inquiry with others, because we realize our own lens is distorted. So I better start talking to other people and seeing their perspectives, because that's going to help me get outside of my limitations and my own perspective. It propels us to deeply question ourselves and our assumptions, and to just look and look again, striving for the naked, unadorned truth. Now that practice, this practice of cultivating a relentless interest in seeing clearly, in knowing what's true in each moment, rests on another practice, which is this practice that I've included in the principles of evolutionary culture of beginner's mind. And what this means is it's a practice of not already knowing. It's a practice of letting go of what we already know. In a sense, you could say it's a practice of innocence, but not the naive innocence of a young child. Not an innocence in which we throw out and reject hard-won wisdom that we already have, but it's a way of suspending everything that we think is true, and always being more interested in what we don't yet know than in what we already know. So we kind of can say, well, okay, if I already know something, then it will still be there. I'll still know it even when I let go of it. I don't have to hold on to it to know it. If it's true, it will continue to be self-evident. And so I can just let go, and I can rest in this place of innocent interest, not knowing. So I don't know, but I want to know. So we're emptying out, in a sense, of all of our fixed ideas and assumptions and beliefs. It's a very beautiful experience to have too, even though it's terrifying to the ego to not know. But it's a very calming, ultimately for the deeper parts of us, it's a very calming, easy place to be, because we're really not clinging on anymore. There's not a fear, there's not holding on, there's a letting go of knowing, and then a willingness to I'm jumping into my next practice. That's why I stopped myself, because I was bringing up the word trust. So I'll go ahead and transition to the next practice, because the next practice is very related to this, and it's what it really means to trust in life, or, if you will, trust in God, to trust in the mystery. Those words get thrown around a lot these days. Oh, I just need to trust the universe, or I just need to trust life, or I just need to trust God, whatever context we're in. but very often it means something that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because very often what people mean by that is they're trusting that some external force or something outside of them is kind of going to take care of things if it's sort of like, if I stop trying to make if I stop trying to push my agenda, or if I stop trying to make things happen, then like some external cosmic force will somehow step in and take care of it. And in my experience, I don't want to some degree there are more things in this under heaven and on earth than any of us can imagine, and there do seem to be mysterious forces at work, etc., in certain situations. But we don't want to rely on any of that. That's what I'm trying to say, and that's not a very. I wouldn't call that a very wise way to live, to just kind of cast it all into the hands of some hopefully benevolent external force that we believe in, even though we claim we've left the mythic God in the sky behind. Instead, though, but we don't. But this notion of fundamental trust or essential trust, what it really is pointing to is this profound mystery, this really equally sacred and profound, if not more sacred and profound, reality that when you let go of the need to know beforehand what's going to happen, of the need to control outcomes, and you allow yourself to trust, not in some external force, but to trust that what you need to know will be revealed in the moment. What you do is you make yourself available for a mysterious process to begin to happen within you and through you that you really can't even know anything about. But what begins to happen is there's a spontaneous emergence of wisdom. And even you could say guidance, but it's, again, guidance is kind of dualistic, because it sort of tends to imply that there's something outside you that's giving you guidance, and it's not really, I don't really see it that way. But it's that if I make the choice to go out to that edge, to let go of everything, of all my certainty, all my knowing, all my need to control life and have it go my way, and I just allow myself to show up empty-handed, that what we find is that a depth of wisdom and clarity, and also the passion and drive and power to act on it, it all shows up from somewhere utterly mysterious to us that we don't know anything about, and that we'll never know anything about. It's the great unknown. And this is really arguably if you had to say there's like the key to living an enlightened life, it would be this practice of trust that I'm talking about right now. Because see, it's not that we need to feel trusting, it's that we need to decide to trust, decide to act from this place, unpremeditated, unscripted. And it doesn't mean we are not wise and doing long-term planning for our, goals and projects. It's not that we don't do that, but it's that there's just a fundamental relationship to it all of trusting something deeper that emerges when we don't grasp. So that is a practice. It's this practice of essential trust. Now, another way to look at what it means to practice trust is to say that we're, in a sense, we're willing to risk. I mean, I wasn't sure whether to make this one practice or two practices as I spoke about it, because they're so intertwined. But let's make it a separate one for the moment. It's the practice of risk-taking. Because and not careless risk taking, not reckless risk taking, and not risk taking just for its own sake. But you see, many of the things that a spiritual life requires of us will feel like a gigantic risk to the part of ourself that's organized around comfort, safety, and security. This ego, what we've been calling ego in this context. So there are often in a spiritual, like if you're really facing the truth, as we talked about earlier, that's going to mean you're going to often see things that you were avoiding previously and that other people are avoiding that need to be said. It's like the truth once known needs to be named in any context, in a relational context where you suddenly realize, hey, there are lies between us. We're deceiving each other. We're deceiving ourselves. We're pretending something didn't happen that did, that needs to be addressed. We're, avoiding how bad things are, or we're denying how good things are, or whatever it is. But when we start to face and see the truth, then there's this sense of overwhelming risk sometimes to speak the truth that needs to be named. And so we, in this evolutionary spiritual path, we make a practice out of healthy risk-taking for a greater good. Always for a greater good, right? Not just for me to get what I want, not for its own sake, because it needs to be done. And there are, again, this is one of our principles of evolutionary culture around risk-taking. And sometimes it's around speaking challenging truths. Sometimes it's about revealing something about ourselves that we're terrified for other people to see. And that could be a limitation or something we're struggling with, that, we have a self-image of having it all together and being very smart, and then in a certain situation we don't know what to do, and we're afraid to take the risk to tell people, I don't know what to do because I'm responsible here, and so we pretend. So like it can be a risk to admit a limitation or admit that we don't have it all together, but it's an authentic risk for a greater good, because if we don't, we're potentially going to do more harm, more damage through our ignorance. So that's a risk many people are afraid to take, to admit they don't know to others, to admit they have a certain vulnerability or weakness that they're struggling with, or lack of capacity. But on the other side of it, we're also just as terrified sometimes to stand for our own depth in the world. In other words, to fully step into the deepest, most awake a part of ourselves and speak from there with great clarity and reveal our own true self that we've actually discovered. Because there's a sense that when we do that, we can't go back, because the world will now expect it of us, and we're not sure whether we have, what it takes to consistently show up with that much clarity and courage and care, love, heart, wisdom, all these capacities maybe that we do have access to, but we kind of don't know where they come from, so we don't know how to guarantee it, so we're afraid, so we won't stand for it, so people will hide their light. That phrase from the Bible, don't hide your light under a bushel. People will hide the deepest, truest part of themselves out of fear for being called to a higher responsibility by showing that. So we'll act less enlightened than we are. We'll dumb down. We'll pretend. So it goes both ways, and the risk-taking here is whatever is in all of these different directions. So it's really a practice of consistently taking emotional risks, the risk to be vulnerable, the risk to be authentic, the risk to challenge a situation, the risk to step up and out and reveal our own wisdom, and many other things. But so just to make that a practice is also a big part of this work. And maybe one of the most challenging parts. Because it means walking straight into those things we're most afraid of.